Hello, I'm Claire and welcome to my channel. So today's video is going to be another instalment in my Perfumer Profile series. Today's perfumer is someone who has created over 400 fragrances during his career, someone who is famous for having popularised the category of gourmand fragrances, and someone who owns their own brand, as well as someone who has 2 fragrances in the Perfume Hall of Fame. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Olivier Cresp. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire. I have made a few videos in this Perfumer Profile series already. I've got 4 perfumers under my belt, so I'll leave those linked down below in the description box in case you do want to check out those other videos. But I've already profiled Quentin Biche, Francis Kurkdjian, Dominique Roupignon, and also Jerome Epinette. So if you are particularly interested in one of those perfumers, please do go check out those videos. So let's get started with Olivier Cresp. I'm going to talk you through his first fragrance, where he's worked, where he works now, and really just his most famous creations. So Olivier Cresp was born in 1955 and he was actually born in the town of Cannes in the south of France. His family are really based around the Grasse area, and of course Grasse is very famous for the production of perfume raw ingredients and perfumes themselves. Olivier was really part of a perfume dynasty. His parents, his grandparents and his great-grandparents were all involved in the fragrance industry, but none of them were perfumers. His great-grandfather grew roses and jasmine for the perfume industry. His father and his grandfather both traded in raw materials for the perfume industry, and his father in particular traded in citrus oils from the area of Calabria in Italy. He traded in grapefruit, lemon and also bergamot, along with mimosa, rose and tuberose. So it was somewhat inevitable that Olivier would end up in the perfume industry, considering his family's connections. Olivier actually says that smelling these raw ingredients at a young age made him interested in perfumery, and he says that he created a very rudimentary fragrance aged as young as 8. He says that by 9 he knew that he wanted to become a perfumer. Cresp says that because of his dad's connections he often dined with perfumers as a child, and actually many of his family members have gone on to be perfumers. So his sister is a perfumer, his brother supplies perfumery ingredients, and actually his son and his daughter are also involved in the perfumery industry. Ironically, age 16, Cresp wrote to the firm that would later employ him, and they turned him down. They told him that he couldn't possibly work for them because he would need a basic degree in chemistry. This firm was Firmenich. So at the time, really, you had to go to perfumery school. Graduate training schemes did exist, but they were few and far between. They had very limited places, even more so than nowadays. And ironically, even Cresp's brother and sister got places at Roewe's perfumery school, but Cresp did not. When Cresp turned 18, his father had a plan. He wanted to send him to the US. If he couldn't go to perfumery school in France, then he would have to go to the US to learn the trade. His father had strong connections to the industry, and he knew that Biddle Sawyer in New Jersey would employ him. Biddle Sawyer now supplies chemicals to other industries, but at the time they were an important flavour and also fragrance chemical supplier. It's at Biddle Sawyer that Cresp learnt to recognise many food and fragrance ingredients, and that crossover between food and fragrance became ever more clear to Cresp. Cresp stayed there for 2 years. He worked in the factory and was processing ingredients. He became familiar with how absolutes and concretes were produced, and he really learnt all about the world of flavours and fragrances. After 2 years in New York, Cresp returned to France and he began working for a company called Loewe Aire. Much like Biddle Sawyer, they produced aroma chemicals for the fragrance industry. Very soon, Cresp went on to work for a company called Quest. Quest were eventually bought out by Givaudan, but at the time they were an independent company and they were an important player in the fragrance industry. It was at Quest that Cresp got some big breaks. His first fragrance has been really hard to pin down, but from looking in databases, I believe his first fragrance may have been Loewe Aire. Aire was originally released in 1985, and I've tried modern flankers of Aire, but I've never tried the original fragrance. Aire is described as a floral, citrusy, slightly herbal, green kind of fragrance. It's a cheaper and it has old school touches to it, such as aldehydes, but it's still quite yellowy green feeling. It's said to have neroli and to have a cologne-like feel to it. This description does not sound like any other Cresp fragrance I've ever tried, and I'm surprised that this was his first fragrance, but clearly it must have been popular if flankers are still being produced 40 years later. In the late 80s, Cresp went on to produce other fragrances for other brands, including another for Loewe. But really it was in 1992 that Cresp got his big break. Thierry Mugler and Clarins were really wanting to break into the fragrance industry. They wanted a fragrance that was strong, something that was impactful, and they commissioned 3 different fragrance companies at least to put forward their ideas. They contacted Firmenich, they contacted Robertet, but they also contacted Quest, and Quest sent Cresp. Interestingly, when you read accounts of how Angel was created, you will often read that it was inspired by fairgrounds, that it was inspired by memories Thierry Mugler had. But actually, Cresp says that he originally created a fragrance called Pachu within a week of receiving the commission. Pachu was something that was really original for the time. It was based around patchouli, as you might expect from the name, but it had a really innovative ingredient. Ethyl maltol was something that was used widely in the food industry, but it hadn't really taken off as a fragrance ingredient. Ethyl maltol has a candy floss, a cotton candy-like nuance to it, and when it was paired with vanilla, it gave off a really playful feeling sweetness that offset the patchouli perfectly. In Pachu, Cresp used ethyl maltol at a percentage of 0.5, but this would be totally eclipsed in future by Gourmand fragrances that would go after Angel. Fragrances such as Loewe Aire, Black Opium, which Cresp would also go on to formulate, and also Flower Bomb. Those fragrances would use ethyl maltol at concentrations up to 20 times what Cresp used in one of the original Gourmand fragrances, Angel. Cresp began to work with another perfumer called Yves de Cherie, and they developed Pachu over a series of iterations. They became obsessed with trying to create something really strong, and actually Cresp felt like he was going down the wrong avenues. He started adding florals. He started to add jasmine and rose. After all, that's what he knew. That's what his family dealt in. Thierry Mugler tried the fragrance with the florals added, and he hated it. He didn't want florals in his fragrance, and he began to talk about his childhood. He talked about his love of coffee, he talked about his love of hot chocolate, and he also talked about the pastries that he would dip in his hot chocolate as a child. Cresp felt immediately inspired, and he began to think about adding praline, honey, even chocolate to the fragrance. After 600 formulations, Angel was finally finished. Angel is a fragrance of extreme contrast, and I have to say I didn't get the love for Angel until I smelt the vintage formulations. This is my 3rd bottle of vintage Angel, and really with vintage Angel I suddenly realised I did smell cotton candy. I smelled candy floss in this fragrance, which is something that I've never smelt in the modern formulations. I get sweetness in the modern formulations for sure, but I never distinctively smelt something approaching candy floss in them. I think for me, this fragrance is interesting because it's got the berries, it's got the honeyed sweetness, and it's also got that chocolatey feeling patchouli. But the patchouli also has this bodily feel to me. It's got a carnality about it. It really is a very sexy fragrance, and I definitely see why this one completely stood out on the market back in 1992. And of course, being a bit different, in a time of no social media, Angel was not an instant hit. It took time. Thierry Mugler and Clarins stood firm. They had belief in this fragrance that it was something that was going to make them a lot of money, and they kept it on the market. And actually it took 5 years, but by 1998 Angel was outselling Chanel No. 5 in France, and that's an amazing success story. In 2007, 15 years after Angel's release, it was awarded a Perfume Hall of Fame award by the Fragrance Foundation. Cresp says, looking back, formulating Angel nowadays would be so much easier because the chocolate accords have improved no end. He said that's what took him all the time, trying to find something that was realistically cocoa-y. And now with modern extraction techniques such as CO2 extraction, he says that wouldn't be so much of an issue. If you do want to know more about Angel and other Mugler fragrances, I have a specific video charting the history of Mugler fragrances. So I will leave that link down below in the description box as well in case you do want to check it out. So following the success of Angel in 1992, Cresp moved to Firmenich, and he moved country to Germany to join the firm that had first rejected him when he'd written to them all the way back when he was 16 years old in 1971. During his early years at Firmenich, Cresp went on to formulate a lot of fragrances for LVMH, including many male-marketed flankers of popular female-marketed lines. So, for example, he formulated the male-marketed versions of Kenzo Jungle, of Loewe by Kenzo also, and also of Dior's Dune. In 1996, he also got to work with Jean-Paul Guerlain on a fragrance to kind of mark a change in direction for Guerlain. Guerlain had been acquired by LVMH back in 1994, and LVMH were keen to modernise Guerlain and make it attract a younger audience. They brought in Cresp to try and moderate the Guerlain style, and what they came up with was the fragrance Champs-Élysées. Ironically, in the end, I don't think this fragrance was initially a commercial success, and I think it was reformulated quite early on to make it slightly more Guerlain-like in style. In 1998, Cresp took on a commission from Cacharel. Cacharel were known for really bold florals, quite loud, green, strong fragrances like Eden and Anais. And really, they were looking for something softer, something more modern, something more 90s. So Cresp made Noir. Noir is a soft, musky, floral fragrance, and it also has a very surprising coffee note, again showing off Cresp's little touch of gourmand in an otherwise quite musky, soft fragrance. It was a slow burn for sure, but it was a quiet and surprising hit. In 2001, lightning struck twice and Cresp had another huge hit. So this time it was for Dolce & Gabbana, and Dolce & Gabbana wanted a fragrance inspired by the Mediterranean blue waters off the coast of Sicily. Dolce & Gabbana had approached Cresp as far back as 1999, and over 2 years Cresp developed what would later become Light Blue. The composition consisted of a tart green apple accord paired with something called Delta Muscone, which is said to mimic the scent of human skin. The fragrance also contained a combination of 3 synthetic woods, Z11, Ambrox, and also Norlimbinol. This combination was paired with natural cedar, and the fragrance also contained a nod to Sicily in the lemon oils that it used, which were actually obtained from the Isle of Sicily. Cresp says that despite the long development time, Light Blue is a fragrance that he managed to make within 40 modifications, so less than 1/10 of the modifications that he'd spent when he was making Angel. Personally, I struggle with Light Blue, but I know that Light Blue is loved by lots of people and it's been an incredibly successful fragrance. Light Blue, even 14 years after its release, was charting in the top 7 bestsellers in the US, along with its male-marketed counterpart. Light Blue was given the Fragrance Foundation's Hall of Fame Award in 2016, 15 years after its first release. And when Cresp was asked recently which 3 fragrances he would take with him if he could only choose 3, Cresp chose to take Light Blue. I believe Light Blue is Dolce & Gabbana's most successful fragrance to date. As is typical with many perfumers, if you've been watching my videos, only 4 years later, in 2005, Cresp actually duped his own fragrance. So he went to work with Moschino and he ended up making a cheap and chic fragrance called I Love Love. I Love Love is essentially an orange-based version of Light Blue. It's really quite striking, if you've tried both of those fragrances, just how similar they are. In 2006, Cresp also formulated a couple of other fragrances that were really successful. So the first one is Angel Demon by Givenchy. So Angel Demon, I've been lucky enough to try the original formulation of that fragrance and I love it. It's such a beautiful vanilla fragrance with such an interesting opening. It's quite herbal in the beginning, but then it dries down into something that smells almost like a root beer jelly bean to me. It's very distinctively spicy, ambery, but just the most beautiful vanilla. I really love that fragrance. I've tried the modern formulation of that fragrance also, and I can't say that it's exactly the same as the vintage. I do much prefer the vintage, but yes, Givenchy Angel Demon, a stunning fragrance. He also created a fragrance for Kenzo that year called Amour. Amour is described as a powdery, almost makeup-y smelling vanilla and rice fragrance. And Amour actually went on to win the Luxury Perfume of the Year in 2007 at the Fragrance Foundation Awards. In 2007, Cresp went on to formulate a few other fragrances that really do smell very much alike, and these were released for rival brands. So the first fragrance that he formulated was Midnight Poison for Dior, and this was in collaboration with Jacques Cavalier-Belletrude, along with Francois de Monchy. This fragrance is really a deep, ambery, dark feeling rose and patchouli fragrance. If you imagine a rose but made very gothic and having a very, very strong patchouli, that's the kind of fragrance Midnight Poison was. It was marketed by Eva Green, and she was dressed in this really beautiful blue dress, and she has this really extreme eye makeup on. It totally echoes the vibe of the fragrance. Also that year, Cresp formulated YSL's Elle. So YSL's Elle was also produced along with Jacques Cavalier-Belletrude, and this fragrance is really a spicier version of Midnight Poison. It's also a little bit more fruity than Midnight Poison. The similarity between the two fragrances is really striking, but YSL's Elle, I think, remains on the perfume market, whereas Midnight Poison has sadly been discontinued. In 2007, clearly vampy gothic fragrances were in, because Cresp also formulated a third gothic feeling fragrance that year, Tom Ford's Noir de Noir. So this again was alongside Cavalier, and also this time along with Harry Fremont. So Noir de Noir, if you haven't smelt it, is the fragrance that I would imagine wearing to have dinner with a vampire. It's got a really strong rose, patchouli, earthy kind of feel to it, but it's got this kind of truffly aspect as well, which is very typical of Tom Ford fragrances. Think of Black Orchid. It is very gothic feeling, and it's something that has almost a red wine feel to the rose as well. It's very distinctive and definitely one of my favourites from Tom Ford. So that's Noir de Noir. In 2010, Cresp did a bit of a 180, and he went back towards cleaner, more minimalistic kind of fragrances with DKNY's Pure. And then in 2011, he moved on to Diesel's Loverdose. Loverdose is a fragrance that is based around anise, licorice and vanilla, and it's often compared to other fragrances with those kinds of notes, such as Black Opium, which Cresp would go on to produce, but also to Lolita Lempicka by Lolita Lempicka, which was formulated by Annick Menardo. So Annick Menardo was working with Cresp in 2011, and they actually formulated together Coco Rico by Jean-Paul Gaultier. And it makes me wonder whether Cresp was maybe talking to Annick Menardo about this new commission that he had with Diesel, and maybe was inspired by her perhaps. 2011 was another golden year for Cresp, and he ended up working for Penhaligons. He had already worked with Penhaligons on a fragrance called Castile many years back, but in interviews, Cresp says that Penhaligons was really his first experience of working for a niche brand rather than a designer brand. And actually, Penhaligons presented him with a bottle of gin, and they said that's the brief. You want to get a perfume that smells like gin. Cresp had previously travelled to Russia, and he says he felt inspired to use juniper in the fragrance, as you might expect with a gin fragrance, but he said that he was inspired by the juniper berries that he'd smelt in Russia. With Juniper Sling, Cresp said that from the outset he told Penhaligons that he wanted to make them a bestseller, and within 2 to 3 years he got his wish. Juniper Sling ended up being their bestseller, beating out their former number one of Blenheim Bouquet. When Cresp was asked why Juniper Sling was such a success, Cresp said, "It's unusual, it's spicy and it's distinctive." From Olivier Cresp's moment of producing fragrances for Penhaligons, Cresp began to produce more niche fragrances. He never really abandoned designer fragrances. That really clearly is where his loves lie. But he started to explore the world of niche, and he began to make fragrances for brands like Olfactive Studio. He also created Modern Muse for Estee Lauder, which also won him a Perfume Award. In 2014, Cresp had a big commission along with 3 other perfumers, and he went on to formulate with them YSL's Black Opium. So Black Opium is a flanker inspired by Opium, but clearly has nothing to do with the original Opium other than the fact that it's inspired by addictions. So Black Opium is really focused around the darkness of coffee, vanilla bean, cedar and patchouli, and contrasted with whiteness. So whiteness from florals such as orange blossom and jasmine, and also brightness from pink pepper, but also from pear. It's a very sweet fragrance, but it's got such a beautiful dry down. It's much maligned now because, it got very popular. At one point, I was smelling this everywhere. It was something that you couldn't escape from. When this first came out, I was in love and I just had to own this. I remember trying it in a department store, maybe in 2014, 2015, and I immediately had a bottle. This was my signature fragrance during my PhD. I wore it loads. I wore it in my final Viva. It's something that always makes me think fondly of those years I spent wearing it. So that's Black Opium. Interestingly, when YSL wanted to launch their next fragrance in 2016, Cresp was the only one of the 4 perfumers re-employed to work on YSL's Mon Paris. And clearly this fragrance built on the concept that Black Opium had started because, again, it was reflecting a modern pillar, a modern interpretation of an older pillar fragrance. So clearly Mon Paris is a branch out from YSL's original fragrance, Paris. 2017 saw Olivier Cresp return to Mugler, this time with a posse of other perfumers to produce a new pillar fragrance, hopefully to emulate the success that Angel had had. So this fragrance was Aura, and Aura is a wet tropical green vanilla fragrance, but it has very distinctive and really quite challenging notes of rhubarb, ylang ylang, and there's also a minty aspect to this. Not for everyone for sure, but something that completely fitted with Mugler's aesthetic at the time. Loud and really quite weird. 2017 also saw Cresp produce a flanker fragrance of a fragrance that he had been out a while. Cresp had been making Mercedes-Benz fragrances, which is really something that you'd never really think of as associated with perfume. You think of Mercedes-Benz as a car company. But they had their own fragrance line, and actually this fragrance has one of the highest scores I've ever seen on Fragrantica. This fragrance is loved. I remember buying a bottle of this one, which is Mercedes Club Black, a few years back, and I remember getting it for the bargainous price of around £22. So what's that? That's probably about $27, something like that. It was so cheap, and I could totally see why people were falling in love with it. I think it got compared to Spiritueuse Double Vanille by Guerlain. I personally wouldn't compare those two. I think it's much closer to something like Kayali's Vanilla 28. It definitely does have a little bit of a resinous feel to it, but I wouldn't say it's overtly resinous. To me, I got much more Ambroxan, which is why I decluttered that one. But I know that it's loved, and truly, it has made that line. That is really what Mercedes fragrances are famous for. And Cresp made that fragrance. 2018 ushered in a whole new project to Cresp's life. So along with his daughter Anaïs, he really went into business with her to create a line of fragrances based around the idea of addiction. Akro, in French, with 2 C's, means addiction, and the brand was actually named Akro with a K. Anaïs lived and worked in Ladbroke Grove in London, and she was inspired by the sights and the smells that she saw around her, and she wanted her dad to really create this fragrance line with her. There were 6 fragrances in the original release, and Cresp says that his favourite is Haze. So Haze is based on the green stuff, and it was supposedly inspired by the Notting Hill Carnival in 2009. It has absinthe, clary sage and mugwort. Akro are incredibly distinctive, and I think there's a lot of praise for the line. I think the reason for that is because they're not afraid to be niche and to do something a little bit weird or a little bit different, something that's not universally likeable. And some good examples of that are fragrances like Night, which has a cumin note, which some people find very bodily and almost sweaty feeling. Another fragrance that I love personally, but I know that other people perhaps don't, is Dark, with its slightly dirty feeling patchouli. To me, it smells like dark, powdery chocolate, but to others, it smells off-putting. So yeah, I think Akro have tried to do something different. I think that's really where the success has come from. Having said that, I really feel like the brand's breakthrough came with fragrances like Bake. So at the same time, Olivier Cresp was actually making fragrances for Dolce Gabbana very much along the same lines as Bake. And I think the comparisons between Bake and between Devotion didn't do Devotion any harm. I feel like people who perhaps wanted Bake bought Devotion, and I think that's kind of ironic from Olivier Cresp to kind of dupe his own brand with a designer fragrance. I would love to try more fragrances from Akro. I think it's a stunning brand, and I love how Cresp, as an almost king of gourmands, has really fed that into the line and made that part of really what he's representing with his own fragrances. I think it's a really brilliant collaboration with his daughter, and I welcome smelling more of these. So that's the Akro line. In 2021, Cresp produced a flanker fragrance for Azzaro. So this is Wanted Girl by Night. This is everything that I should dislike in fragrances. But do you know what? I had one sniff and I was hooked. And I think this really exemplifies Cresp's ability to play on things, to play on memories that we remember from childhood. So this one is a grape scented fragrance. It smells like a lollipop or an ice lolly. This is really something that has an almost Concord grape-like accord, which I know is a very sort of childhood smell to a lot of people in the US. But for me, I found it addictive. It was almost a boozy fragrance as well, but still quite sticky and quite sweet. Just something that I think Cresp is really, really good at. So that's Wanted Girl by Night. So in 2022, Cresp was in demand again, and this time for the brand new brand of Born to Stand Out. Born to Stand Out really like to try and be edgy and cool and do something different. And I guess Cresp was a really good fit with that, with his Akro fame. So Cresp made a fragrance called Dirty Rice. I think this one really plays on the rice milk kind of trend that's still very popular today. But this fragrance remains their bestseller despite more releases since. In 2023, Cresp collaborated with his son, Sebastien. Sebastien is also a perfumer, and they together formulated a fragrance for Kayali. It's actually Yum Pistachio Gelato. It got leaked, people were talking about it way before the release, and it was really very anticipated because of the way it had been advertised. People were expecting a pistachio gelato, they were expecting something very overtly gourmand. And it wasn't that at all. It was quite a reserved feeling gourmand fragrance really in the main. And I think that actually made it an even bigger seller. It wasn't a fragrance that smelled just straight up like food. It was something that's actually quite gentle and really wearable and still quite addictive feeling in a way. I think this fragrance is perhaps one of Kayali's best sellers after Vanilla 28, and I think this one will be long on the market. And really this year and more recently, Cresp has concentrated again on producing fragrances for his own line alongside his designer creations. So this year we had Crush from Akro, and that was based around Cresp's love of macarons. Cresp also revisited his Devotion line. He's produced a number of flankers for the Devotion line now. And he also has produced a new fragrance for Nina Ricci called Venus. When Olivier Cresp was recently asked about how the fragrance market has changed over the years, he highlighted actually that the number of releases has massively increased over the time that he's been a perfumer. He says he laments the loss of the times when 300 fragrances would be produced per year. And now the market is saturated, he says, with up to 8,000 releases per year. He says it's too much, and it means that there's pressure on perfumers to do things quickly and to make several iterations of a fragrance for a fragrance house per day, when in actual fact, in previous years, they might be expected to do 10, Now they're expected to do 50 per day. He says really the deadlines are very strict, and he also says that he works on many more fragrances at once, splitting his attention. He also warns about the impact of AI on the creativity of the fragrance market, and I think that's something we all need to look out for. I really feel like AI fragrances are probably already here with things like Toy 2 Pearl, but I think they're going to get ever more present and perhaps won't even be overlooked by a perfumer anymore. Quite recently, Cresp was also asked which fragrance does he wish he'd created, and for female marketed fragrances he highlighted Guerlain's Shalimar, citing his own attempts to make fragrances for Guerlain with the Champs-Élysées range. For the male marketed fragrance, he always says that he wishes he'd produce Eau Sauvage for Dior. And really these are two very classical feeling fragrances, which is really surprising from someone who's considered the king of Gourmand. Cresp has been honoured with the Chevalier des Arts and des Lettres from the French Ministry of Culture in 2012, and he's also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Fragrance Foundation in 2018. So Olivier Cresp is now 70 years old and he shows no signs of slowing up. He's still releasing lots of fragrances, including for Akro, his own brand, which has been on the market for 8 years now, but also with Firmenich, working with designer and niche brands. Cresp has so many fragrances with 440 and he's been so successful, and I really am intrigued to see what he will produce next. So please do let me know which is your favourite fragrance by Olivier Cresp. And also, please let me know if you tried his own brand fragrances, Akro. I'd be really interested to know if you have a particular favourite. And thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, then please do press the like button. And please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.